The sound of cracking ice pierced the winter's silence like a gunshot, echoing through the pristine wilderness of Montana's Glacier National Park. In that fraction of a second before gravity took hold, Michael Cooper realized two things. He was about to die, and he had never told his father he was sorry. The world tilted, crystalline fragments exploding around him as the frozen lake's surface gave way beneath his feet. His last glimpse of the world above was a canvas of steel-gray clouds framed by jagged ice before the darkness swallowed him whole. Like this video if you want to know how Michael survives this deadly encounter with nature, and subscribe to witness an extraordinary tale of survival that will change everything you thought you knew about wild animals. At 35, Michael hadn't planned on dying. Not here, not like this. The icy water knifed through his clothes, stealing his breath and clouding his thoughts. His heavy winter gear, once protection against the bitter cold, now dragged him deeper into the dark waters. The surface, a pale glow above, seemed impossibly far away. His lungs screamed for air, and the cold, God, the cold, was unlike anything he'd ever felt before. It wasn't just cold. It was death reaching for him with frozen fingers. Somewhere in his oxygen-deprived mind, a voice that sounded suspiciously like his ex-wife Sarah whispered, "I told you solo hiking was a stupid idea." The same voice that had told him 6 months ago that he was throwing away their marriage for 60-hour workweeks and promotions that couldn't keep him warm at night. The same voice he'd ignored, just like he had ignored the weather advisory this morning, convinced that he knew better, that he could handle anything life threw at him. Michael kicked hard, his movements sluggish in the frigid water. His body wanted to gasp, to draw in air that wasn't there. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. Just when he thought his lungs would burst, his hand broke the surface, clawing at the broken ice. The edge crumbled under his grip, plunging him back into the darkness. Panic surged through him, giving him one last burst of desperate strength. This time, when his hand found ice, he spread his weight, remembering long ago survival training. Rolling onto the surface felt like lifting a mountain, but somehow he managed it. He lay there, gasping, the ice creaking ominously beneath him. The wind, which had seemed crisp and invigorating just minutes ago, now cut through his soaked clothes like a blade. "Move," he wheezed through chattering teeth. "Move or die." His father's voice this time, stern and uncompromising as always. The same voice that had told him he was making a mistake leaving his stable engineering job to join a tech startup. The same voice he'd been trying to prove wrong for the past decade. Michael crawled away from the hole, each movement an agony of cold and effort. His clothes began to freeze, turning him into a living statue. The shore wasn't far, maybe 50 yards, but it might as well have been 50 miles. His phone was in his pocket, probably ruined by the water. The emergency beacon in his pack was still strapped to his back, but his fingers were too numb to work the clasp. The tree line wavered in his vision as he finally reached solid ground. The late afternoon sun was already dipping behind the mountains, taking with it what little warmth it had provided. Michael knew he needed shelter, needed to get out of his wet clothes, needed a fire, but his body was shutting down. Each breath was a battle, and his thoughts moved like molasses. He stumbled toward the trees, his legs giving out halfway there. The snow cushioned his fall, but he couldn't find the strength to get up again. A strange warmth began to seep through him, and somewhere in his addled mind, he remembered this was bad. This feeling of comfort was hypothermia's sweet lie before death. As his consciousness began to fade, Michael thought about the email sitting unread in his inbox, the one from his father trying to reconnect after their last fight. He thought about Sarah and how her voice had cracked when she'd signed the divorce papers. He thought about all the moments he had pushed aside, convinced there would be time later to fix things, to say the words that mattered. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a sound that his freezing brain couldn't quite process, a low rumbling growl that seemed to make the very ground vibrate. Michael tried to turn his head, but his muscles wouldn't respond. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was a massive shape moving through the trees, and a pair of eyes that seemed to glow in the gathering dusk. His last coherent thought was a bitter realization. He'd come to the wilderness to find himself, to escape the mess his life had become. Instead, he found only silence and cold, and what sounded suspiciously like his death approaching on padded feet. As consciousness slipped away, the irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his whole life running from connections, and now, in his final moments, he would have given anything to feel connected to someone, to something, one last time. The darkness took him then, and Michael Cooper, son, ex-husband, workaholic, and lost soul, disappeared into the gathering storm, unaware that his story was far from over, and that sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms. A low rumble vibrated through Michael's chest, dragging him back to consciousness. His eyelids felt frozen shut, but somewhere beyond the darkness, something massive was breathing. Each exhale sent warm puffs of air across his face, carrying the musty scent of earth and wild things. His survival instincts screamed at him to run, but his body remained trapped in a cold-induced paralysis. With monumental effort, Michael forced his eyes open. The world swam into focus, and his heart nearly stopped. Not 3 feet from his face was the broad head of a grizzly bear, its dark eyes studying him with unsettling intelligence. The bear's fur was a rich brown touched with silver, like autumn leaves dusted with frost. A long scar ran down its right shoulder, a testament to battles survived and winters endured. Michael's mind raced through everything he knew about bear encounters: play dead for grizzlies, fight back for black bears. But this was different. The bear wasn't attacking, it was just watching. Steam rose from its nostrils in the frigid air as it tilted its head almost quizzically. In his hypothermic delirium, Michael could have sworn the creature looked concerned. "If you're going to eat me," Michael whispered through cracked lips, "get it over with." His voice emerged as barely a rasp, his throat raw from the icy water. The bear's response was unexpected. It huffed softly and moved closer, pressing its massive body against Michael's frozen form. Heat radiated from the animal, seeping through Michael's ice-encrusted clothes. The bear's fur tickled his face, and he caught himself wondering if this was how hypothermia victims hallucinated before death, imagining comfort in their final moments. But the warmth was real. Gradually, feeling returned to his extremities, bringing with it the knife-edged pain of thawing tissue. Michael bit back a cry as sensation flooded back into his frozen limbs. The bear remained steady beside him, a living furnace against the bitter cold. Had the bear dragged him here? The thought seemed impossible, yet the evidence was clear. This wasn't just a random encounter. The bear had deliberately saved him from freezing to death. Michael's scientific mind rebelled against the notion, but he couldn't deny what was happening. "Why?" he whispered, not expecting an answer. The bear's ear twitched at his voice, and it turned its massive head to look at him again. Those eyes, they held something Michael couldn't explain. Not the mindless hunger of a predator, but something deeper, more deliberate. The sun had set completely now, plunging the forest into darkness. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and despite the bear's warmth, Michael knew he needed more than just body heat to survive the night. He needed dry clothes, shelter, fire, all the things that seemed impossibly out of reach in his current state. As if reading his thoughts, the bear suddenly rose to its feet. Michael tensed, certain that the strange spell would break and nature would take its course. Instead, the bear moved to the edge of their shelter and began pawing at something in the darkness. The sound of cracking wood filled the air as the bear effortlessly broke down dead branches. Michael watched in stunned disbelief as the bear assembled a pile of dry wood within reach of where he lay. The animal's movements were purposeful, almost methodical. It even brought smaller twigs and what looked like dry pine needles, perfect tinder for starting a fire. "You've got to be kidding me," Michael muttered. His hands shook as he reached for his jacket pocket, praying that his waterproof matches had lived up to their name. The bear watched intently as he struggled with the matchbox, his fingers still clumsy with cold. The third match caught, and soon a small flame flickered to life. The bear showed no fear of the fire, settling back down beside Michael as the warmth began to spread through their shelter. The fire cast dancing shadows on the bear's fur, and for the first time, Michael noticed distinguishing marks around its face, patterns that gave it a distinct personality. "You need a name," Michael said softly, his voice stronger now. "I can't keep calling you the bear in my head." He studied the animal's noble profile, remembering the way it had found him, guided him, protected him. "Scout," he decided. "I'm going to call you Scout." The bear, Scout, huffed softly, as if approving the choice. As the fire grew stronger and feeling returned to his body, Michael found himself talking to Scout, telling him about the stupid decisions that had led him here. The bear listened with what seemed like genuine interest, occasionally making soft sounds that almost seemed like responses. "My ex-wife would never believe this," Michael said with a weak laugh. "She always said I was terrible at connecting with others. Now here I am, having a heart-to-heart with a grizzly bear." Scout's ear twitched, and he shifted closer, providing more warmth. As the night deepened around them, Michael realized something profound. In all his years of running from relationships, avoiding vulnerability, here he was, trusting his life to a wild creature that, by all rights, should have seen him as prey. The irony wasn't lost on him. Perhaps this was what rock bottom looked like, or maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something extraordinary. Scout's steady breathing beside him was oddly comforting, a reminder that he wasn't alone in the vast wilderness. As exhaustion began to overtake him, Michael placed one trembling hand on the bear's thick fur. "Thank you," he whispered, and meant it more than any thank you he'd ever said in his life. The bear's only response was to curl more protectively around him, a living shield against the darkness and cold. As Michael drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just random chance. Something profound was happening here, something that defied explanation but demanded to be embraced. Morning light filtered through the pine branches, casting dappled shadows across Michael's face. He awoke to find Scout still beside him, the bear's massive form radiating warmth in the crisp dawn air. The fire had burned down to embers, but Michael felt stronger than he had any right to be after yesterday's brush with death. His clothes had dried during the night, though moving sent sharp pains through his frozen muscles. Scout stirred as Michael sat up, the bear's dark eyes watching with that same unsettling intelligence. The events of the previous night felt dreamlike in the morning light, yet here was living proof that it hadn't been a hypothermia-induced hallucination. A grizzly bear had saved his life, built him a fire, and stayed to keep him warm. "I don't suppose you know where I could find some breakfast?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice light despite the gnawing hunger in his stomach. His pack was lost somewhere near the lake along with all his supplies and emergency gear. To his amazement, Scout rose and ambled to the edge of their shelter. The bear paused, looking back at Michael with an expression that clearly said, "Well, are you coming?" Michael stumbled to his feet, wincing as his stiff muscles protested. Scout waited patiently, adjusting his pace to match Michael's labored steps as they moved through the forest. The morning was bright but bitterly cold. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, transforming the landscape into a glittering wonderland. Under different circumstances, Michael might have found it beautiful. Now he saw only the devastating isolation, the miles of wilderness separating him from safety. Scout led him to a cluster of berry bushes, their branches still holding frozen fruit beneath the snow. The bear demonstrated by carefully pulling berries free with his teeth, then looked expectantly at Michael. Despite his situation, Michael couldn't help but laugh. "You're like a wilderness guide," he said, gathering handfuls of the tart berries. They were bitter with frost, but his empty stomach didn't care. As he ate, memories of shared meals with Sarah flooded back. Sunday brunches, anniversary dinners, all the moments he'd rushed through or missed entirely because work seemed more important. "I really messed up, Scout," Michael said quietly, not sure why he was confiding in a bear but unable to stop the words from spilling out. "I had everything: a woman who loved me, a father who wanted to be part of my life, a job that meant something. But I was so focused on proving myself, on being successful, that I lost sight of what actually mattered." Scout moved closer, pressing his warm bulk against Michael's side. The gesture was so human, so understanding, that Michael felt tears freeze on his cheeks. He buried his fingers in the bear's thick fur, drawing comfort from the solid presence beside him. "Sarah used to say I was afraid of depending on anyone else," Michael continued. "Said I kept everyone at arm's length because I couldn't stand the idea of being vulnerable. Now look at me, completely dependent on a wild animal for survival. The universe has a sick sense of humor." Scout led him to a small stream next, breaking through the ice with one massive paw so Michael could drink. The water was painfully cold but clean, and Michael hadn't realized how dehydrated he was until the first sip touched his lip. As he drank, Scout demonstrated another survival technique, showing him how to find tender bark and roots beneath the snow. Their strange partnership fell into a rhythm as the morning wore on. Scout seemed to understand exactly what Michael needed, leading him to food sources and sheltered areas where they could rest. The bear's behavior defied everything Michael knew about wild animals, yet there was no denying the intentional care in every action. During one of their rest stops, Michael found himself studying Scout's scarred face, wondering about the story behind each mark. "You know what it's like to survive alone, don't you?" he mused. "To fight your way through each day, never sure if you'll make it to the next." Scout's eyes met his, and Michael felt understood in a way that transcended species. The bear's presence was changing him, forcing him to confront truths he'd been running from. Out here, stripped of all pretense and protection, Michael couldn't hide behind his usual defenses. His carefully constructed walls were crumbling, leaving him raw and exposed. Yet somehow, he felt safer than he had in years. "I spent so much time trying to prove I didn't need anyone," Michael said, watching his breath form clouds in the frigid air. "Pushed away everyone who tried to get close. My father just wanted to understand me, to be part of my life. But I was so convinced he was trying to control me that I shut him out completely. And Sarah," his voice cracked, "Sarah just wanted me to be present, to share a life together instead of just occupying the same space. I couldn't even give her that." Scout shifted closer, offering warmth and silent support. The bear's steady presence was teaching Michael something profound about connection, how it didn't always need words, how sometimes just being there was enough. He thought about all the times he dismissed Sarah's attempts to connect, too busy with emails or phone calls to notice her slipping away. As the sun climbed higher, Michael realized they needed to move. The temperature was dropping again, and despite Scout's warmth, he knew he couldn't survive another night in the open without proper shelter. His body was already showing signs of strain from the hypothermia and exposure. "We need to find help," he told Scout, not caring how crazy it seemed to explain things to a bear. "I won't last much longer out here." Scout rose immediately, as if he'd been waiting for Michael to reach this conclusion. The bear seemed to consider for a moment, nose testing the wind before choosing a direction. Michael followed, trusting this impossible guide who had already saved his life once. As they walked, Michael felt something shifting inside him, a fundamental change in how he saw himself and his place in the world. Here, in the harshest possible circumstances, he was learning what it meant to truly connect, to trust, to be vulnerable. The irony wasn't lost on him. It had taken a wild bear to teach him what the humans in his life had been trying to show him all along. The fever hit Michael like a thunderclap, turning his world into a kaleidoscope of pain and confused images. His leg, injured during the fall through the ice but ignored in the struggle for survival, now throbbed with an angry heat that contrasted sharply with the winter air. Each step became a battle, the frozen ground seeming to tilt and spin beneath his feet. Scout noticed the change immediately. The bear's rhythmic pace slowed, and he kept turning to check on Michael, huffing with what sounded remarkably like concern. When Michael stumbled for the third time, Scout pressed against him, offering his bulk as a living crutch. "Something's wrong," Michael mumbled, his voice thick and slurred. The world swam before his eyes, trees multiplying and dancing in his vision. The cold, which had been his constant enemy, now battled with waves of intense heat that rolled through his body. He pressed a shaking hand to his forehead, feeling the unnatural warmth there. Scout guided him to a sheltered spot beneath a large pine tree, its branches heavy with snow. Michael collapsed against the trunk, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The bear's nose pressed against his cheek, testing his temperature in an eerily human gesture. "Infection," Michael managed to say, though he wasn't sure why he was explaining it to a bear. The cold must have masked it before. He tried to focus on Scout's face, but the bear seemed to blur and shift, sometimes looking like Sarah, sometimes like his father. "I'm sorry," he whispered to these fever-induced apparitions. "I'm so sorry." Scout disappeared into the gathering dusk, and for a moment, blind panic gripped Michael's heart. "Don't leave," he called weakly, hating the desperation in his voice but unable to contain it. He had spent so many years convincing himself he didn't need anyone, and now here he was, terrified of being abandoned by a wild animal. But Scout returned quickly, his mouth full of something green and bitter-smelling. The bear dropped the plants at Michael's feet, nudging them toward him with his nose. Through the haze of fever, Michael recognized them. Yarrow, nature's antibiotic. He had read about it in survival guides but never thought he'd need to identify it. "You want me to eat these?" Michael asked incredulously. Scout's response was to push the plants closer, his eyes intense and insistent. With trembling fingers, Michael picked up the yarrow, crushing the leaves as he'd read about in those long-ago guides. The taste was bitter and astringent, making him gag, but Scout wouldn't let him stop until he consumed every leaf. The fever dreams came in waves after that. Michael drifted in and out of consciousness, each awakening bringing a new hallucination. He saw Sarah standing at their kitchen counter, tears streaming down her face as she asked, "Do you even want to be married anymore?" He saw his father at his college graduation, trying to hug him while Michael stood stiff and unreachable. He saw moments of connection he'd rejected, chances for intimacy he'd thrown away, all playing out against the canvas of his burning mind. Through it all, Scout remained. The bear's presence was the only constant, the only thing Michael could trust was real. Sometimes he felt Scout's rough tongue cleaning his face, cooling his fever. Other times, the bear would return with more yarrow, forcing Michael to eat the bitter leaves. When the shivers became violent, Scout would curl around him, sharing his warmth and keeping the worst of the cold at bay. In his more lucid moments, Michael talked to Scout, pouring out confessions he'd never shared with another living soul. "I push people away because I'm terrified of losing them," he admitted during one such moment. "If I don't let them get close, it can't hurt when they leave." Stupid, right? They leave anyway, and it hurts more because I never gave us a real chance. Scout listened with what seemed like genuine understanding, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. The bear's steady presence was teaching him something profound about unconditional love, how it asked for nothing, demanded nothing, simply was. The fever peaked during the darkest hours of the night. Michael's world dissolved into a chaos of fear and regret, his body burning while his mind splintered into 1,000 sharp-edged pieces. He called out for Sarah, for his father, for anyone who might hear him in the vast wilderness. But only Scout answered, pressing closer, offering comfort in the only way he could. "I don't want to die alone," Michael whispered into Scout's fur, his words barely audible over the howling wind. The bear's response was to curl more tightly around him, as if to say, "You're not alone. I'm here." In that moment of complete vulnerability, something broke open inside Michael. All the walls he'd built, all the defenses he'd maintained, crumbled like ice in spring. Tears froze on his cheeks as years of suppressed emotion poured out of him. Scout bore it all, steady as a mountain, while Michael finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loneliness, his regret, his desperate need for connection. As dawn approached, the fever began to break. Michael's consciousness returned slowly, like a ship emerging from fog. He found himself cradled in Scout's warm bulk, the bear's steady breathing a comforting rhythm against his back. The world still spun slightly when he opened his eyes, but the burning heat had subsided, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. "You saved my life again," Michael said softly, reaching up to touch Scout's scarred face. The bear huffed softly, nuzzling Michael's hand with surprising gentleness. In the pale morning light, Michael could see fresh tracks in the snow around their shelter, wolf prints. Scout had protected him through the night, keeping predators at bay while Michael fought his fever. The realization hit him with stunning clarity. This was what love looked like, not the carefully controlled affection he'd allowed himself to show, not the measured doses of vulnerability he parceled out to Sarah and his father. This was raw, unconditional, and completely selfless, everything he'd been afraid to give or receive. As feeling returned to his body, Michael made a promise to himself. If he survived this, if he made it back to civilization, he would learn to love like Scout had shown him, wholly, fearlessly, without reservation. He would tear down the walls he'd built and learn to be as vulnerable as he was in this moment, trusting another being with his life and his heart. Scout seemed to sense the shift in him, pressing his nose against Michael's chest, where his heartbeat pulsed steadily beneath layers of cloth and newly gained wisdom. Together, they watched the sunrise paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, two souls connected by something deeper than words could express. The morning brought clarity and a grim realization: they needed to move. Michael could feel the infection lingering in his system, temporarily beaten back by Scout's herbal intervention but far from defeated. The fever had left him weak, each movement requiring concentrated effort. Staying meant certain death as another storm gathered on the horizon. Scout seemed to sense the urgency. The bear's behavior had changed, becoming more insistent, almost agitated. He kept looking in a specific direction, then back at Michael, his massive head bobbing in a way that clearly said, "We need to go now." "All right, big guy," Michael said, using Scout's bulk to pull himself to his feet. "I trust you." The words caught in his throat. Trust had always been his biggest struggle, yet here he was, literally putting his life in the paws of a wild animal. The irony wasn't lost on him. They moved slowly through the snow-laden forest, Scout constantly adjusting his pace to match Michael's labored step. The bear carved a path through the deep snow, making it easier for Michael to follow. Every few minutes, Scout would stop and look back, waiting patiently when Michael needed to rest. The sky darkened as they traveled, heavy clouds rolling in from the west. The wind carried the promise of snow, and Michael could feel the temperature dropping. His body, still weak from the fever, trembled with each gust. Scout pressed closer, sharing his warmth as they walked. "You know where we're going, don't you?" Michael asked during one of their rest stops. Scout's ears twitched at his voice, and those intelligent eyes seemed to hold a certainty that Michael desperately wanted to believe in. The bear had already proven to be more than just a random animal. There was purpose in his actions, a deliberate intent that defied explanation. As they crested a small ridge, Michael heard it, the distant thrum of helicopter blades. His heart leaped, but the sound was faint, too far away. Scout's reaction was immediate. The bear's head snapped up, nose testing the wind before he began moving with renewed purpose. "They're looking for me," Michael realized aloud. The thought brought a rush of emotion, hope mingled with fear. Would they find him in time? Would Scout stay once other humans arrived? The bear had become more than just a savior. He was a friend, protector, teacher. The thought of losing him created an ache in Michael's chest that had nothing to do with his physical condition. The helicopter's sound faded, then returned, stronger this time. Scout led them toward higher ground, away from the dense forest canopy. Michael's legs felt like lead, each step a monumental effort, but he pushed on. The bear's urgency was contagious, driving him forward despite his exhaustion. They emerged into a clearing just as snow began to fall. The open space felt exposed after days among the trees, but Scout seemed confident. The bear positioned himself in the center of the clearing, then did something that made Michael's jaw drop. He rose on his hind legs and roared. The sound echoed off the mountains, powerful enough to make the falling snow vibrate. Scout dropped back to all fours, waited a few moments, then roared again. Michael watched in amazement as the bear systematically announced their location to the searching helicopter. "You incredible creature," Michael whispered, tears freezing on his cheek. "You're calling them to us, aren't you?" The helicopter's rhythm changed, growing louder. They'd heard Scout's call and were turning toward them. Michael's heart raced as the sound grew closer, but then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Scout was backing away. "Wait," Michael called, reaching for the bear. "Don't go. Please." Scout paused, turning back to look at Michael one last time. In those deep eyes, Michael saw everything he needed to know. It was time to let go. The bear had done what he'd come to do, had taught what needed to be taught. Now it was up to Michael to carry those lessons forward. The helicopter appeared over the tree line, its searchlight cutting through the falling snow. Scout melted into the forest shadows as the aircraft descended, but Michael could still feel his presence, watching, protecting until the very end. Rescue personnel rappelled down, their orange jackets bright against the white landscape. They rushed to Michael, voices calling out medical terminology and coordinates, but Michael's eyes remained fixed on the tree line, where a large shape still lingered. "Thank you," he mouthed, knowing Scout would understand. The bear's form shifted, and for a moment, just a moment, Michael swore he saw Scout nod before disappearing into the wilderness. The rescue team worked quickly, securing Michael to a stretcher as they prepared to lift him to the helicopter. One of the medics asked, "How did you survive out here for so long?" Michael smiled, thinking of all the ways Scout had saved him, not just physically but spiritually. "I had help," he said simply, "from someone who taught me what it really means to trust." The medic looked confused, but Michael didn't elaborate. Some things weren't meant to be explained, only experienced and carried forward. As the helicopter lifted off, Michael caught one last glimpse of the clearing below. There in the fresh snow, a set of massive paw prints led away into the forest, proof that it hadn't been a dream, that something miraculous had truly happened. The landscape fell away beneath them, the wilderness transforming into a white canvas stretched to the horizon. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of everything he'd learned settling into his bones. Scout had shown him a different way to live, had taught him that true strength lay not in independence but in the courage to be vulnerable, to trust, to connect. As consciousness began to fade, Michael made a silent promise, to Scout, to himself, to everyone he'd pushed away. He would not waste his second chance. The walls he'd built would come down, one by one, until he could love as fearlessly as a bear who chose to save a stranger. The helicopter flew on through the falling snow, carrying Michael back to civilization, but part of him would always remain in that wilderness, forever changed by an impossible friendship and the unconditional love of a creature who had no reason to care, but chose to anyway. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors, a rhythm that had become familiar over the past week. Michael sat propped up in bed, staring out the window at the snow-covered mountains in the distance. Somewhere out there, Scout was roaming the wilderness, perhaps helping another lost soul find their way back to what mattered. The doctors called his survival a miracle. They couldn't explain how he'd avoided severe hypothermia, how he fought off infection without antibiotics, how he'd managed to signal for help in the perfect location. Michael didn't try to explain. Some truths were too precious, too profound to be dissected by medical science. Sarah visited on his third day in the hospital. She stood in the doorway, hesitant, her eyes taking in the changes in him. "You look different," she said softly, settling into the chair beside his bed. "There's something. I don't know. You seem more present." Michael reached for her hand, and for the first time in years, he didn't hold back. He told her everything, about the fall, about Scout, about the lessons he'd learned in the wilderness. He let her see his tears, his vulnerability, his regret. Sarah listened, really listened, her hand warm in his. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "About so many things. I thought being strong meant not needing anyone, not showing weakness. But true strength, it's about being brave enough to let people in, to risk being hurt because the connection is worth it." Sarah squeezed his hand, her own eyes wet. "The bear taught you that?" "Scout," Michael corrected gently. "He showed me what unconditional love looks like. No expectations, no demands, just presence, pure connection." He paused, gathering courage. "I know it's too late for us, but I needed you to know that I understand now what you were trying to tell me all those years." His father came the next day, bringing with him the weight of years of misunderstanding. But this time, when his father reached for him, Michael didn't pull away. They talked for hours. Really talked, about hopes and fears and regrets, about second chances and the wisdom that sometimes comes too late or just in time. As his strength returned, Michael began making plans. The wilderness had given him a gift, and he intended to honor it. He established the Scout Wildlife Foundation, dedicated to protecting grizzly bears and their habitat. The organization would focus on promoting coexistence between humans and wildlife, teaching people about the intelligence and emotional capacity of these magnificent creatures. The story of his rescue made national news. "Man saved by guardian bear," the headlines read. Wildlife experts were skeptical, offering scientific explanations for the bear's behavior. But Michael knew better. He'd seen something in Scout's eyes that defied explanation, a wisdom and compassion that challenged everything humans thought they knew about wild animals. 6 months after his rescue, Michael stood at the edge of that same clearing where he'd last seen Scout. The foundation was hosting its first educational event, teaching local children about bear conservation. As he watched the excited faces of the children learning about wildlife, he felt a familiar presence. There, at the tree line, a massive grizzly stood watching. The scars on his face were unmistakable, as was the intelligent gleam in his eyes. Scout had returned, just for a moment, as if to check on his student's progress. Michael's heart swelled with emotion as he caught the bear's gaze. Scout hadn't just saved his life, he'd shown him how to live it. The bear had taught him that love wasn't about control or protection or keeping people at arm's length. It was about trust, about being present, about choosing connection even when it scared you. The children gasped as they noticed Scout, but the bear remained calm, seemingly aware of his role in this moment. He sat back on his haunches, regarding the group with that same patient wisdom that had guided Michael through his darkest hours. "That's Scout," Michael told the wide-eyed children. "He's the reason we're all here today. He taught me that sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected teachers." As the sun began to set, Scout melted back into the forest, but his impact remained. Michael had transformed his life, rebuilding relationships and forming new ones with an openness he never thought possible. He'd learned to be vulnerable, to show his heart, to connect deeply with others instead of hiding behind walls of self-sufficiency. The foundation grew, its message spreading far beyond the local community. Michael often found himself speaking to groups about conservation, but more importantly, about connection, with nature, with each other, with the parts of ourselves we're afraid to show the world. Sarah became involved with the foundation's work, and slowly, their friendship deepened into something new. Not the same as before, but perhaps something better, something built on genuine understanding and shared purpose. They took things slowly, both aware that real change required patience and conscious effort. On quiet evenings, Michael would sometimes return to that clearing, sitting in silence as the sun set behind the mountains. Sometimes Scout would appear, a silent guardian watching from the trees. No words were needed between them. Their bond transcended language, a testament to the profound truth that love knows no boundaries. The wilderness had broken him open, stripped away his defenses, and shown him a better way to live. Through Scout, he learned that true strength lies not in standing alone, but in the courage to be vulnerable, to trust, to love without reservation. As Michael watched the last light fade from the sky, he smiled, feeling Scout's presence in the gathering darkness. The bear had given him more than just survival. He'd given him a second chance at living, really living, with an open heart and the courage to connect. And that, perhaps, was the greatest miracle of all.